welcome. It's lovely to have you along here today, and thank you for giving up your time this morning for this conversation. So I guess just to start off with, how did teacher agency become an area of interest for you?
Well, there is a long and involved question. I could give you a long history on it as well.
Yeah,
I was a history teacher back in the 90s. I did a bit of work in IT in New Zealand in the late 90s, but I was primarily a history teacher. I was still doing that when we came back to the UK in 2000. And I started an EdD at that point and went to a seminar by Meg Maguire. Many of you will know her work. I think it was about the work of principals, high school teachers. And there was an interesting discussion raised in that seminar about agency and structure, which intrigued me because I hadn't really come across that very much. Was right at the start of my own doctoral journey. And I got sort of interested in this whole notion of whether something is agency or structure. And I sort of parked that a little bit. And then as the EdD developed, I got interested in, first of all, the work of Anthony Giddens, who talks a lot about that. And then subsequently, Margaret Archer, who was a big critic of Giddens and had, I think, a much more nuanced view of agency than the work that Giddens had been producing in the 80s. And that led me to sort of frame my doctoral thesis around the idea of culture, structure, agency as determining factors. And then I read a piece by Biester and Tedder, which is from a Learning Lives project, a big project which was done in further education colleges in the UK. And they were looking at agency in relation to adult learners and how adult learning could improve agency. But I was intrigued here because there was a very different view of agency being positive. This wasn't a sort of binary of structure agency where one is posited against the other. It's structural agency, or is it a bit of both? But this was an ecological view that suggested that agency is something that's emergent from the context. So it's the interaction of the individual with the available resources and in light of the constraints. So it's about affordances and context. And agency is emergent and it's always unique and it changes from situation to situation. And that seemed to me to be very pertinent in relation to the work of teachers. So we started to have a look at, and Gert had already joined Stirling at that point, and we had some conversations and we started to have a look at some of the available literature around teacher agency and found that there wasn't really that much. And what there was tended to use agency rather uncritically, almost like a slogan. It talked about teacher agency, or it talked about agency in relation to the work of teachers, but what it didn't do was conceptualize or even necessarily theorize agency very much. It didn't, for example, say what it meant by agency. Agency was taken often as a given. And so we started to develop this work. And some of the original work I did with Richard Edwards in relation to a project on curriculum making around 2008, 2009. And then we picked up working with Gert. We had an ESRC project to have a look at teacher agency specifically. And we worked with 3 schools in the local authority in Scotland and spent about a year in these schools. It was a sort of in-depth project. We had a researcher pretty much located in the schools all the time. And the end of that project, the result of that project were the publications that people are familiar with, including the book Teacher Agency and Ecological Approach. So that's where we're coming from. Now, unbeknown to me at the time, there were a separate group of researchers in Finland who we now subsequently work with quite a bit, Kirsi Pihalto, Tiina Soini and Jani Pitarinen, who were working on teacher agency, but using a completely different set of theoretical constructs, mainly related to activity theory. And there was earlier work by people like Anne Edwards, of course, looking at relational agency and that sort of mode as well. So this is, I suppose, an emergent piece of work. The work we're doing at the moment around agency is more related to how teachers make curriculum and how curriculum making provides context to develop teacher agency. Again, another interesting strand of work, I guess.
Gosh, there's a lot there. And you're right, we could actually just have a conversation just on that. And I guess I'm really interested in this ecological agency, I guess that model for understanding the achievement of agency. And I guess in that research you were talking there about being in those schools, what were some of the key findings that you found in relation to agency and what was happening in those schools?
Well, what we found primarily is how extraordinarily difficult it is for teachers to achieve agency in the constraints, in the context of modern Scottish education. I don't think Scotland is particularly unique in this respect. We work with teachers around the world and work with academics around the world, and we're seeing many of the same sorts of features. So we see ostensibly rhetoric about making schools more autonomous, for example, school empowerment. We see rhetorics about teachers being the curriculum developers, the curriculum makers, the agents of change. But actually, if you have a look at the day-to-day constraints that surround the work of teachers, what we see are people hemmed in by really two forms of regulation. Input regulation, which is external agencies, primarily governments, ministries of education, curriculum agencies, etc., providing a curriculum product which is predefined. Now, that the latest models of curriculum products in most countries tend to be fairly loosely defined. They're more frameworks than prescriptive sets of requirements that schools have to follow step by step. So that's quite different, for example, to the original national curriculum in England, which was very prescriptive. However, they still come with their own forms of input regulation, and often in Scotland, at least, these are mediated by local authorities who put their own layers of prescription on, for example, providing teaching materials in many cases and schemes of work and so on. So that's one form of regulation. The other form of regulation is output regulation, and really this is much more pernicious, and it's, I suppose, part of what might be described as the neoliberal project. The idea that we can grant autonomy but steer from a distance using performance indicators and outcomes and mechanisms such as inspections, evaluative use of attainment data, and so on. And certainly Gert Biester has written that these are much more corrosive of teacher agency and school autonomy than any input regulation. Now, in Scotland, we have mainly output regulation, but what we have is an environment where it becomes extremely risky for teachers to innovate. We have a curriculum which provides an awful lot of aspirations about what schools should be like, and a system which actually places blocks on how that might happen. So that in many cases, schools tend to play safe. They go with the existing system. They're still determined in secondary schools, at least, by the demands of external assessments and national qualifications. Primary schools are very much bound by demands to show raised attainment in literacy and numeracy at the moment. We're seeing considerable evidence of curriculum narrowing there as well. You know, and the virtual disappearance in many schools of arts-based subjects, for example. Even science is getting downgraded because literacy and numeracy are what are important. So that sort of provides a sketch of what the environment is like. And within that, then, the idea that teachers can be agentic to make choices to develop curriculum in ways which are locally context specific is actually quite difficult, quite challenging. Now, what we saw in our research project, we worked with 2 secondary schools and 1 primary school, were teachers who saw the potential of the new curriculum in many cases. In at least 2 of the schools, they saw the potential but felt that they couldn't really do much about it. So there was a distinct lack of agency there. In 1 of the schools, conversely, there was I suppose, a real sense of increased or enhanced agency, that the teachers talked enthusiastically about the new curriculum and how they were developing it. And that seemed to us to be quite interesting, because when we looked at the teachers, they were broadly similar in terms of beliefs, values. They had similar backgrounds professionally. They were all experienced teachers. Some of them had backgrounds outside of education. They'd had similar teacher education routes. They shared similar environments. In fact, the 2 secondary schools, the buildings were very similar. They were both new builds, serving similar sort of student intakes. So what was the difference? That was an intriguing question. Well, the difference surfaced through some network analysis. One of the significant findings is that the agency in the 1 school was enhanced by the existence of particular types of teacher relational working or teacher relationships. So the embedding of teachers in networks which weren't hierarchical and top-down necessarily, They were much more horizontally embedded in the school. They enabled things like cross-faculty working. There was a lot of informal cross-faculty working in this particular school, rather than the sort of very formal stuff which is coming together for staff meetings. Conversely, in the school where there was limited agency, the school meetings were described as being like school assemblies. You turn up, you listen, you go away. It was all about routine business. There was no time or space to discuss the big ideas about education. So we can start to paint a picture here about how meaningful networks, which are long-standing, which are strong, which have formal and informal aspects to them, relatively asymmetrical, networks where there weren't major imbalances of power, where staff all were colleagues rather than one set sitting up there and another set down here. All of these things here were significant. And what networks do is they enable, obviously, relational resources to be accessed by teachers. So we're talking about things like sources of ideas, protection, encouragement, particularly if the school leadership teams are willing to protect people when they take risky decisions, all of these sorts of things. Yeah. But we also see, I suppose, what might be described as cultural resources. We're developing a culture where innovation is being encouraged, where it isn't down to someone high up the hierarchy to give permission. But we're developing a culture where people share ideas readily. So we're interrupting cycles of habitual practice because new ideas are continually interrupting the old practices, all of these sorts of things. And that I think served to be a powerful stimulus to changing practice in this one school, and actually doing it through affording greater levels of teacher agency in the work that people were doing day to day.
Yeah, and something I've just sort of taken from that is when you said innovation, because I guess if we were to think about why should society care about teacher agency, I think that innovation is just one strand of many. It kind of stands out to me as to, why it's important. And I think about the challenges that come in. I think about what COVID has presented, and then take COVID away, just all the other things that keep coming into schools. It's like there's always something coming in. There's many different things that schools are supposed to kind of process, take on board, put in place. What do you think about that in terms of, why society should care about teacher agency?
Well, society should care about teachers and teacher agency because society needs educated people. If you have a look at some of the complex challenges in modern societies, environmental challenges, social challenges, mass migration, for example, we're looking at societies where there are, in some cases, increased levels of crime, cybercrime. We're looking at societies where populist politicians are able to exploit uneducated populations to get into power. All of these things. We require critical citizens. Now, I would argue that we can't have critical citizens unless we have schools which are culturally responsive, which are locally, contextually appropriate for the populations they're serving, and where actually, I would argue we're more democratic schools where we have student agency. Now, student agency isn't possible if you have strictly hierarchical schools where people just wait to be told what to do. And plus, we can add to that teaching, education is always a complex and dilemma-ridden enterprise. There are no simple recipes. It's socially contingent. It's messy. It's not something you can legislate from outside and just hope that it happens. I'm citing Walter Doyle here, who's writing back in the 90s that to teach effectively, teachers must be responsible curriculum theorists. Now, there's all sorts in that quotation. The word responsible, what do we mean by that? But the idea that actually teachers should be not just applying an algorithm or a recipe, but actually thinking and developing their own theories about their practice and so on. And doing so in the light of what we know about curriculum and curriculum theory. And in that light, curriculum making is always, and again, I'm citing Walter Doyle here, a deliberative process of interpretation, judgment, and responsibility. Okay, so, teacher agency is at the heart of that. If we don't have agentic teachers, then teachers can't do that. Now, of course, what we've had in recent years, I think, is a tendency for governments to try and design teacher-proof curricula. The notion that we've got creeping centralization, we see in the universities as well, where people who don't necessarily know much about education and certainly are not local experts about the schools that they're serving, are seeking to determine, to shape what's happening. We see bureaucratic systems, we see reductive, ultimately counterproductive approaches that really deprofessionalize teachers. Now, in that light, we don't need drones or technicians, we need agentic teachers. And I'll repeat this again. And a concept that my colleague Daniel Alvanger coined in the book we've recently written, Curriculum Making in Europe, is that we need curriculum-proof teachers. We need teachers who can constructively mediate what are often poorly conceived policies in the light of, I suppose, what might be considered to be carefully considered reflection on what those policies are, critically conceived, but also carefully thought out ideas about what are the purposes of education and what are the educational values of the driving our practice. That all requires agency.
Yeah, and yeah, really interesting, Mark. And I think last academic year, I did a master's in educational research at Stirling Uni, and my dissertation I wanted to explore links between ecological agency, coaching skills, coaching approaches, and coaching cultures. I was really interested in, you know, your ecological framework, and then where does coaching, how does that all come into that? Because there's a lot of things that I see connections with. So you mentioned teachers' professional and life histories, their belief systems, you know, how much in their school context is there, like, what are the relationships like? Where is the power dynamics, you know, within a school environment? And there was kind of 5 themes that came out of my research. And one of them was the sort of fear of the unknown. Like, if you don't know what coaching is, for example, and it's not explained or transparent, people are they're very fearful of what it might be and what people might be trying to do to them. But also, kind of at the other end of the spectrum, a theme was teachers felt empowered when they had coaching conversations or coaching dialogues within their school. It gave them time to think. And they found that coaching conversations sort of promoted a much more an equal relationship type status within schools, which can make a big difference to how comfortable you feel, or, like, coming back to your point about the risks that you might take. And then the other thing that kind of came through as a theme was all the transferable skills that come with learning coaching techniques. So, you know, learning about how to do listening, you know, active and deep listening, learning how to question, summarize, paraphrase, all of these skills that we often expect within schools, but don't necessarily spend a lot of time unpicking what those look like and how we do them. It was really interesting because there are definitely links there, and some of Rachel Lofthouse's work, you know, has highlighted that in the past as well. I wonder what your kind of initial thoughts are around coaching, you know, skills, approaches in schools and those connections to agency.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, and I wouldn't profess to be any great expert on coaching. I know Rachel quite well, and I know her work a little bit. I mean, I suppose one of the difficulties here is around definitions, isn't it? And it's always the same in any area. It's the same with curriculum. Well, what do we actually mean by a curriculum? So what do we mean by coaching? Now, I think Rachel had described coaching as a form of professional inquiry in one of her papers. And I do a lot of work with sort of more, I suppose, large scale professional inquiries. And for me, what professional inquiry does, we have an approach called critical collaborative professional inquiry. What it does is it provides a process, a structured process for engaging with a problem or an issue. It is about identifying what that problem is. It's about having a meaningful dialogue about the problem. It's about coming up with solutions. So it's not just about talking about it, it's about coming to action. And it seems that coaching does all of these things. Now, what these approaches do tend to do is, first of all, they provide structure. It's almost like a pedagogical interaction, I suppose, isn't it? where we have a purpose in mind, and we have a structure for reaching that purpose, and it's done through an experiential learning type approach. But also one of the things that we push very hard in our critical collaborative professional inquiry is the notion of interruption. It is very easy as professionals, or in fact in everyday life, to become consumed by habit, and professional practice should be more than habit. I mean, one of the things I'll say about agency is that going with the flow uncritically is not the same as agency, because it doesn't often involve choices. You know, agency involves really making choices, whether we exercise those options or not. It's the availability of those options that constitutes agency. And I suppose what these processes like professional inquiry do, and coaching as well, is that they enhance people's opportunities to consider the options available to them. So in terms of the individual, they will enhance people's personal professional knowledge. They will open up aspirations about what is perhaps different and what can be done differently. So it's about creating a new future imaginary. It's about dealing with some of the barriers in the context that may get in the way of the action you want to take. So increasing your agency by increasing the number of options you have, through, for example, offering validation for the ideas you have, validation from a significant other, a coach who's knowledgeable, but also, I suppose, providing protection, sources of new ideas, all of these things. So, you know, this is essentially the essence of meaningful and purposeful professional dialogue in any work situation. And coaching is one way of doing it, as far as I can see. Now, in terms of the collaborative professional inquiry approach we use, we've found a whole range of benefits which actually enhance agency. So increased confidence is one. Another one is change dispositions to practice, and that would include, for example, change dispositions for using research findings to inform work. To teachers who would never have considered using research previously are now routinely referring to what the research says when they're making these consequential decisions about their work. It provides relational resources because it brings people together. It's one of the interesting things about professional inquiry, and I'm not sure whether this is the case with coaching, but we've been working with groups which comprise everyone from the principal to the newly qualified teacher, and it has this effect of flattening hierarchies. And many of the teachers have reported to us that they're able to feel that they have a say, that they are part of the curriculum making decision processes in their school, no matter how insignificant they may have considered they were. And that gets us away from this age-old problem of just tell me what to do, and the sort of cultural dependency here. So there's a whole range of sort of benefits here. But I think more than anything else, you know, what we're looking at here is developing agency for the future as well. It's all very well to talk about agency now, because that's partly dependent on past experiences and the ability to sort of deal with the present. But actually, if people have rich experiences, they will enhance their agency for the future, because tomorrow's the future is actually tomorrow's present, and if we're building meaningful experience. So curriculum making, you know, particularly curriculum making that takes people outside of their immediate school context into areas, for example, what we call meso-curriculum making, working across schools, connecting practitioners with policy, and also macro curriculum making. The Welsh experience is quite instructive here. We've got teachers in Wales who are not only making the curriculum in their own schools and classrooms, but they've been involved in supporting colleagues in other schools, and they've also been involved in working groups to write the national curriculum standards, the framework. Okay, so that sort of experience is creating a wealth of future agency, if you like, by creating that future capacity for people to work differently. Now, I've gone off the subject of coaching. I'm aware of that here, but
yeah, I'll bring you back. There was this sort of, when you mentioned that flattening of hierarchy, that was 100% related to that theme that I mentioned, that equality of relationships. So I spoke to about 20 teachers within Scotland, England, and Australia, and they, you know, that was a really strong theme, that coaching enabled that equality that they referred to, or that flattening out of structures. And I think that's really interesting, because schools are very structured. You know, there are very, very structured in the way they've got hierarchy in them. And it's interesting thinking about practically how schools take on that kind of, how are they going to address trying to get that more flattening of structure, because that in itself can be challenging. And I wondered a little bit about your Finnish colleagues, but before I go to that, I'm just going to check. I should have said to everyone at the start, it's lovely if you've got questions, anything that you'd like to, as you're hearing our conversation, please do pop them into the Q&A. And I'm going to jump in there now, because I can see that there is one there. And this comes from Claudia. Thank you. How do you think coaching can support teacher agency?
Well, I should refer back to the answer to the previous question, actually. Yeah, I mean, it's really about the quality of the experience. I mean, I don't see a great deal of difference here between a pedagogical experience that takes place, a curriculum event in a classroom, which is purposeful and experiential and takes account of where the learner, I hate that word, the student is coming from, and where you want them to go to. And it's the same, I suppose, with the sort of approaches to professional inquiry we use. And I'd imagine it's the same with coaching. There is an identifiable issue that's to be discussed. We're coming from a point of view where someone presumably needs to know and understand more about this issue to improve their practice. And by connecting with somebody who has perhaps different experiences, and I'm not saying that they're more experts or better, but different experiences, and having a professional conversation about that, what we're in effect doing is opening up new possibilities. Now, there's always, excuse me, there's always a tendency, isn't there, to see professional development or professional learning as something where someone who is an expert comes in and tells people who aren't experts how to do things differently. And we know from a lot of research now that these are just not effective long-term approaches to changing. They may do a bit of stimulating of thinking in this shorter term, but in the long term, they don't really change practice or change people's perceptions. What changes people's perceptions is engaging in meaningful professional dialogue on a particular issue with other people who offer different perspectives, not necessarily more expert perspectives. And then I would also add to that using the interruption of seeing what has been done in research findings, because research gives us a window into many different things. It's not a medical model of research, it's a cognitive resources model here I'm talking about, where, you know, what worked in this school may not work in our school, but it might give us some insights into saying how we can deal with this particular problem in our school. But that's done through dialogue. And I think that, you know, the agency of the person is being enhanced because we're starting to see alternative courses of action. That's an important part of agency, the projective, the future orientation. We're increasing our professional knowledge. So we're coming to a situation with better knowledge or more knowledge or different knowledge. And that's the practical, that's the iterational. And then we're able then to deal in a more nuanced way with the practicalities of the presence. Now, this sort of relates to the temporal nature of the ecological model, you know, the caudal triad, it's called. The agency is oriented towards past, future, and present tones. It's always acted out in the present, of course. And a couple of other things I just would like to say about agency here, which I didn't say earlier. One is that agency is not the same as action. Okay, there's a tendency in some of the literature to conflate that. We can act without necessarily having agency because there's only one course of action we can take. Similarly, we can have agency but choose not to act, or we can choose to act against. So agency can be resistance, it can be not acting. Agency is the existence of the different possibilities for action. And then I suppose another thing just to raise here is agency is not the same as autonomy. Okay. So we may say that, I mean, this is continually conflated. Now, I'm using autonomy in a very particular sense here because I'm aware there's a lot of literature that conceptualizes and theorizes autonomy in very similar ways to ecological agency, actually. But autonomy is often understood in policy as freedom from regulation. So there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of ideas in the Netherlands, for example, in the last 10 years about their new curriculum. If we just let teachers do it, then they'll get on with it and they'll do it properly. But actually what you're doing in that sense is actually potentially removing teachers' agency, because well-constructed regulation, let's say a policy framing that's intelligent and actually provides resources, can afford agency in a way that absence of regulation may remove it. If you see what I mean. Yeah. So I think we need to be very clear here that when we're talking about agency, we're talking about something that actually benefits from having affordances, and that would include affordances of support, guidance, and indeed regulation, and that coaching could be part of that because it provides that sort of support, that scaffolding, if you like, for people to achieve agency in their work.
Yeah, there's so much in that too, Mark. It got me thinking a little bit about what you were saying there around the a person who is being coached. We often see them as the expert, right? We see them as the expert in what they know for them best. However, through coaching, through the types of questions you ask and the environment you set up for them, it enables them to find a pathway through whatever it is that they're focusing on or the goal that they want to, it's that bit around using coaching to mobilize that person. So to create action. And there was just something you were saying there that kind of like linked me into that, that thought. There are some more questions here, so let me just go. Yeah,
I was just interested in a couple of these questions as they were coming up here.
Is there one that you want to look at first? You choose,
well,
Mark.
There are two here I want to pick up. One's about the future agency. There's another one just popped in as well, I noticed. Yeah, I mean, the future orientation is interesting because I think one of the things to say about agency using this ecological model is that it can change according to context. We can continue to develop fantastic teachers, okay? And those teachers, in theory, should become more agentic as they become more skilled, knowledgeable, etc. But actually, we can also then disable those teachers by putting them in contexts where the affordances don't exist, where the teachers find that it's actually just too difficult to do things because they're hemmed in by all sorts of restrictions or the resources don't exist. Yeah. So the notion of agency for the future, yes, it can change. People can become disempowered over time. And I'm thinking in terms of Scotland here. I know a number of teachers who felt quite empowered, agentic at the time that the new curriculum came along, but have subsequently become very disempowered and actually quite disillusioned and much less likely to take risks in their work, much less likely to engage positively with the new curriculum as a result of their experiences of doing so. So yes, agency will go down over time. And I suppose one of the insights here is we're not talking about excellent teachers as the OECD tends to with its Teachers Matter discourse. We're talking about excellent teaching. And that's not just the quality of the teacher, it's also the context, the conditions by means of which teachers are able to teach. And that's really important, I think. Now, the second question here is I just want to pick up on is the word curriculum making. It actually has rather a long history, this. It goes back to Franklin Bobbitt in 1918, I think. But he was talking very much about a very scientific approach to curriculum where the government comes up with a whole set of outcomes or objectives and people basically apply them in their setting. But there have been much more, I suppose, open-ended and developmental approaches to curriculum making in the literature. I'm thinking Clandon and Connolly, people like Jack Goodlad and Walter Doyle and Zongyi Deng, for example. We've developed a slightly different take on this because a lot of the curriculum making frameworks have been criticized for being quite linear. They comprise a chart with the government at the top and then the teachers at the bottom. And we did in fact start with that. So we're talking about supra, macro, meso, micro and nano curriculum making. But what we've tried to do here is to talk about it in terms of sites of activity. So these aren't linear levels. They're actually different sites with different types of curriculum making, and they're defined not by the institution, i.e. the government or the school, but actually by the type of curriculum making that's been enacted in each sense. So macro curriculum making is about the production of policy frameworks, for example. Meso curriculum making is about the activity that connects schools and policy. It can take place in schools, it can take place in governments, often it takes place in intermediary organizations or through brokers, for example. Micro and nano curriculum making is a sort of curriculum making that takes place in schools, the former being it tends to be the production of schemes of work, for example, and the nano curriculum making is the day-to-day pedagogical curriculum events that happen. Now, we use the term curriculum making rather than curriculum development because actually for two reasons. One is that curriculum development is often associated very much with these top-down linear approaches. You develop somebody else's curriculum, for example. But secondly, I think the curriculum development doesn't capture some of these other activities. It doesn't, for example, capture the notion of the meso support that might be necessary for meaningful curriculum making in schools, nor does it capture, I think, necessarily the sort of pedagogical interactions that happen in classrooms as curriculum. They become distinct. And we're very much into a social practice notion of curriculum here, something that happens, not something that is developed and handed down to us to develop or mediate in our setting, but actually that these are distinctive activities that happen through people coming together, a social practice, and they comprise different practices like content selection, pedagogical choices, assessment and evaluation, timetabling, provision, these sorts of things all comprise curriculum making as well.
And that's a very different approach. And I'm just interested in how that, how I'm thinking about Scotland in particular and how we make that evolution into that kind of approach, because it makes a lot of sense in terms of, it becomes a creating as we go, and there's many people and contexts and things that impact on that process.
Of course, Scotland is about to undergo the publication of what could be quite a critical review of its curriculum by the OECD, which may provide a stimulus for some of this thinking to start to happen.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm just checking, we've got another Q&A from Christopher, so thank you. You've mentioned responsibility. How much does accountability factor into agency? Thanks, Christopher.
That's a huge area, really. I mean, again, I suppose it depends on how we define accountability. I mean, we can talk about accountability in terms of professional responsibility and in terms of how professionals construct their own accountability. And that really is a part of being a professional. I was struck by, and this is something that came through very clearly in our research, actually, Gabriel Salomon's work on teacher responsibility talked about the sort of long, medium and short-term responsibilities. The short-term responsibilities, you're keeping the class under control. We saw that in spades. Teachers are very good at it. Teachers taking their medium-term responsibilities very seriously as well, getting the grades and that sort of stuff. But what we saw less of, and I think this is something that is very much part of what we should be doing as a sort of model underpinned by agency, is thinking about what Salomon called the long-term residues of education. What sort of society are we producing in 20 years' time? What sort of citizens are we producing? How are these people able to deal with the complexities of society? And that's, in a sense, this isn't about the OECD discourse of preparing people for jobs that don't exist yet, and I don't really hold with that. It's about preparing people to deal with complexity and to do so in a critical manner. And I'm struck by, go back to 1968, Neil Postman's famous speech about developing the art of crap detection in schools, and that the primary purpose of education is giving kids bullshit detectors. I think that we can learn an awful lot from this sort of stuff. So that requires, I think, a different type of accountability to what we have. Unfortunately, the sorts of accountability systems we have are very narrowly framed about attainment, outputs, measurement, and they have, I think, a whole raft of perverse incentives wrapped up in them and unintended consequences. And again, I'll go back to the example I gave in Scotland, where the focus in the Scottish Attainment Challenge, which is very admirable on closing the attainment gap, has been framed so narrowly in terms of attainment and in literacy and numeracy that primary schools are overwhelmingly focusing on teaching literacy and numeracy. A great example, in fact, I've had a couple of examples recently. One example I was given was of a class that wanted to do a study on Black Lives Matter. They've been reading about it in the press, it was all over the media, and they were interested in it. It was something they wanted to do. And this seems like, for me, an ideal opportunity to do some school-based curriculum making and to do something the kids are really interested in, but to use it to develop literacy and numeracy. You could have a look at stats, for example, about structural inequality, etc. The message from the school leadership to this particular teacher was, no, we can't do that. The focus is on literacy and numeracy at the moment. So these, I think, are really big questions where, if we have accountability systems that are so narrowly framed, we're absolutely truncating teacher agency, and in doing so, impoverishing and reducing the curriculum down to really what is a bare minimum required to comply with the accountability measures, and that is wrong. And unfortunately, education is driven too much nowadays by narrow performance indicators, attainment measures, etc., and that really is very corrosive on teacher agency.
Yeah, it is. It really eats into that framework of ecological agency that you're talking about, because it's coming, it's top down. This is how it is. This is how it needs to be. And I mentioned your Finnish colleagues. You mentioned right at the start that you came across other researchers interested in this field, and you have colleagues in Finland. And I wondered, what are they finding? What are they seeing in Finland in particular, or other countries? I'm quite curious as to, you mentioned there are a lot of similarities. It's certainly not, we've been talking about sort of Scottish examples there, but what else are they seeing?
I think very broadly similar patterns. I mean, Finland is quite a different context. It's a context, for example, that doesn't have an inspectorate or a national exam system. So teachers have very much more control over the national qualifications, the leaving certificate assessments. But I think the insights from their work have been quite powerful in driving some of the policies in Finland. They interestingly are doing work for the ministry. Actually, they had a big project and sort of stuff I can only dream about €1 million to evaluate the curriculum as it was unfolding over time. And they're very interested, for example, in how shared sense making as a process can be used to facilitate curriculum reform, large-scale curriculum reform. So if you've got a new curriculum which is radically different conceptually than an old curriculum, you can go about it in various ways. You can do it in the way that has tended to happen in Scotland, which is that the curriculum is published, it's given to schools, and schools are given the responsibility for getting on with it. And the national agency produces a lot of guidance for this, but it's not necessarily read because there's too much. But what didn't happen in Scotland, there wasn't a systematic attempt, I think, across the system. There are pockets where it happened, but for many schools, they've moved straight from the publication of the documents to implementation. And often it was, right, well, we'll take the outcomes of the curriculum, this was encouraged, and we'll audit our existing practice and see what we absolutely have to change in order to make this curriculum happen. And what we tended to see in that case is often a quite superficial enactment of the curriculum, which is about the language of the new curriculum being co-opted often to describe the practices of the old curriculum, but often a lot of continuity is staying there. And where changes do happen, they're often incremental changes which are bolted on. The Wednesday afternoon CFE slot in some schools, for example, to pick up the outcomes that weren't been picked up elsewhere in the curriculum. These sorts of things happen. Now, if you contrast that with the Finland approach, the Finland approach involves actually a national exercise of shared sense making involving administrators and school people, which is about understanding the new curriculum and particularly understanding how it is different to the old, conceptually and also practically. And then the schools engage in the new. And that gives, I think, a much better chance of adopting that. So that's an insight from teacher agency, because what that work is doing is essentially saying that part of teacher agency is actually understanding what it is we're supposed to be doing. So if we have clarity of purpose, we have a better chance of actually taking the actions that are appropriate and fit for purpose.
Yeah, and that in itself, it sounds quite simple, but it's actually really key, isn't it? If there's clarity and how things are communicated and how much you feel engaged in the process. There's a lot just in that very simple phrase there, but it's really important, really key. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but there are two issues where we need to shift our mentality, I think, in terms of making the curriculum. One is that there needs to be a commitment actually to resourcing this sort of work, because it's expensive. This isn't cheap and cheerful CPD. It's actually whole-scale engagement with a teaching profession, but it has long-term consequences which are very different. So it's worth the expense, in my view. The second thing I think is a shift in mentality. It's a change of culture. For too long now, we've focused on specifying outputs and measuring people's progress against it. And we know from a lot of research now that that leads to strategic compliance in many places. We have high capacity schools which are better at actually working in the gaps and doing the educational stuff. And that's been the case in, for example, David Leit's work in England. They've shown quite clearly that, a lot of meaningful curriculum development happens despite the system in England. But for many schools, it is simply, they haven't got the time, the resources, or indeed the capacity and expertise to do this. So they simply comply in a strategic way. But we need, I think, to move, to shift it. And again, this is expensive. We need to shift the focus away from this specification and measurement towards designing quality inputs, which are helping people to frame their practice in a supported and guided way. And of course, coaching is one of the mechanisms that can be used to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I wonder, just my last kind of question, I guess, is what's become clearer to you about teacher agency over your research in this field?
Well, I'm still learning, really. I mean, I suppose one of the things that's really stuck out, and we had a similar experience last year in quite a different context when we wrote a report on national qualifications in Scotland. And failed to specify what we meant by validated assessments, and they've been construed in quite a different way to what we hope they'd be construed as. But I think it's about being clear conceptually. I've seen teacher agency being used as a slogan in many countries around the world. It's very difficult to track where these ideas come from, actually. I mean, I'd like to be able to say they came from our book, and of course many of them will have done, and from the particularly the curriculum inquiry paper. Some of them will have come from the work that was done in Finland as well. And there's now a plethora of work being done academically, scholarly work around teacher agency, which is extending the concept in many ways. So yeah, but unfortunately, this is a neat slogan that slots happily into political rhetoric, and it's happened in Scotland. It's been associated with the empowerment agenda for schools, and it's not properly conceptualized. It happened in the United States to such an extent that one of the national unions, teacher unions, had an obsession of the year award went to teacher agency in 2017, I think it was. So it really does highlight the danger here of just uncritically taking a slogan from the research and not using it in a meaningful way that actually clearly uses the concept in a way that improves practice. Okay, so I think that's a really important insight that I've had from this work here and from the subsequent engagement. I'm always astounded by the capacity of the system to move like a kaleidoscope from one concept to the next without actually seeing any contradiction in this.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it gives me a lot of food for thought thinking about coaching and education and how we, it doesn't become like that, like you mentioned there. And I think about one of the things that's become clearer to me is that there's further kind of research needed in this field of thinking about ecological agency in particular, and links to different types of, like I said, coaching skills, approaches, and and creating coaching cultures in schools. And I wonder a little bit about that as a mechanism. It's this thing about how you get away from slogans of teacher agency or slogans of coaching and see how these things can integrate together to create, you know, this innovative. Right back at the beginning, we were thinking about why should people care? Why should society care about teacher agency? And ultimately, you know, looking forward and looking into the future, you mentioned student agency. There's a whole lot that comes from agency. You know, it just doesn't stop at the teacher, does it? And I think this is the bit around how different our schools could be in the future if agency was coming in at all the different like levels of school, thinking about parents and thinking about, you know, students and teachers and all of those kind of connections, because schools are a very wide-reaching community.
I think it's also essential to think about what teacher agency is and does as well. So, you know, the question, teacher agency for what? And I think it's possible to see that the ecological approach in two ways. One is as a heuristic. It's simply to analyze situations and say, is agency happening here? And that's primarily how we would see it. It's not a normative sort of approach, which is trying to encourage certain types of behavior. We were simply trying to understand how it is that teachers are able to act or not, as the case may be, in the settings provided by the particular context. And in that sense, you can take teacher agency as a heuristic and apply it to different contexts, which are very different around the world. So I had doctoral students using it in China, in Uganda, in Turkey, for example. So these are all very different systems, but the approach, because it is about situational analysis, actually seems to work. But then I think there's a deeper question here of, well, so what? Teacher agency for what? You know, and I think there's a danger here if we try and conflate those two, and some approaches do. They try to build in sets of values and systems of purposes into the teacher agency framework. I think that's dangerous territory, because it becomes then more like an orthodoxy or an ideology. I think we can use agency to analyze the situation, but at the same time have a clear sense of what it is we want to achieve from an education system and why. So this isn't, using it as a heuristic isn't about losing our sense of values in education or purposes, but it's a set of tools that can help us facilitate those values, but actually while understanding that different people may have different values, and that agency can be used for different things.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to stop right there because that's a lovely ending. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark. And, you know, I'm hugely appreciative of your time that you've taken to be with us today. To our audience, thank you. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for your questions as well. That's been brilliant to have. And I just want to share something with you now. It'll come up on the screen, hopefully. You can see that okay. And this is just a way to stay connected with us. You can use that QR code there, the Coaching and Education Insights, that will take you through to that. And also we have the upcoming Coaching and Education Conference that you can find out about in the latest GCI or Coaching and Education Insights there. So do tap into that. And just double checking there's no more questions before we come to an end. I think that's everybody. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Mark.